was your life like after your service ended?
I would say my life was very, yeah, that was a darker time. I really was struggling in my faith with God. Um, I, saw some tough things when I was over there, and some horrific things. And I remember coming home and having some nightmares that were pretty awful. And I was having some pretty extreme manifestations of PTSD, which I've later learned, it's not just the combat experience, it's also our childhood and the issues that we go through that then, a lot of military people or veterans have traumatic pasts of things that they've gone through. And so then when you go through combat, it's just, like striking a match on a thing of gasoline that's ready to go, right? So that was, I didn't really know who to talk to about that. There wasn't in 2009, there wasn't any understanding, or like people weren't really talking about PTSD and and any of those things. So I just kept going, and I drank a lot. I was still going to church and trying to make my way through it, and then drinking on the other side. So I was kind of in this washing machine of shame, where I'm not following God. I'm still going to church. I'm trying to keep up this, persona of being a strong leader. And then I'm going and drinking and acting like a buffoon, and just being in a lot of pain. And so, that was a challenging time. I would say that, until I got into music school after, being in the military, that first year and a half was probably the toughest journey I've been on.
So you've been very open about reaching a point of suicidal crisis of your
Mhm.
own. Can you share what led to that moment?
Yeah, I was having some pretty horrific dreams of the things that I saw in combat with some children that had been wounded when I was in Iraq, and so those dreams were just really, they were getting to me, and my parents were not doing well. I felt totally isolated. I felt like I mean I didn't tell anyone about what I was experiencing in my dreams for probably 5 or 6 years after coming home, and just because like once the dreams kind of went away, after a while, and they would come back maybe once a month, once every few months, once a year, something like that. Like it just gets kind of buried, and it isn't until you have these flash triggers, right? And I remember, even after, being home for like gosh, I was probably 24, so I'd been home for about 2 3 years. I was watching a movie with a bunch of my buddies after a snowmobiling weekend. We were in a cabin up in northern Minnesota, and one of the scenes flashed had exactly to do with like a funeral of like, a bunch of guys that had died. And I left my body and I went back to that theater in Iraq where we had that memorial service. And I came back and I was like, I mean, I lost it. And there was just so much pain that had been shoved down, never dealt with, never talked about. And my buddies really surrounded me in that, and they knew like that something wasn't right. So I just think there were so many things that weren't dealt with, that weren't talked about. Um, and 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 then I just got to that point where, I was just overwhelmed with, the shame of my sin and the grief of people dying, and I was drunk one night and wanted to take my life.
What did your mentor say or do that helped you step away from that itch?
Yeah. Yeah, it was in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, and we were on the phone, and he basically just said, what you're going through is what the disciples went through when they lost Jesus. And I was like, what? And didn't really want to talk about that either. But he basically said, like, the disciples were following Jesus for 3 years. They left everything to follow him. They completely trusted him. And then one day he just, gets led away by the Romans and beaten to death and murdered, and he was gone. And they lost their fearless leader, like, and they believed in him like fully, and they had left everything. So they were just devastated. They were lost. They were depressed. And Scott said, that's where you are. Like, you're in a place where you don't understand why you're going through what you're going through. But beneath all of the pain and everything you're going through is a victory, greater than you can imagine. Because beneath the death of Jesus was the defeat of sin, so that we could be free from all the shame and guilt and crap and everything and not have to walk in that anymore. And the disciples just couldn't see that. But then, when Jesus was resurrected and, they saw him and came back to life and that miracle took place, like they understood why they went through what they went through. And then they went and changed the world. And, those 11 guys have now impacted 2.6087314 billion people today. And every one of them were brutally murdered, for following him. And they went and laid down their lives for it. And so Scott just basically said, if you trust God, he's going to use it to change the world. And I said, okay, I'll get on board with that. And I bought into it fully. And now I've been able to impact more lives than I could have imagined at the time.
So what role does spirituality play in long-term healing for you and other veterans?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The science answer out of Dr. Lisa Miller's work, she's in Columbia University, and she's basically proven that military veterans who have an active faith life, the cortical thickness between the right and the left brain is 80% thicker and stronger and able to process emotions in a healthier way. And a lot of times when we're triggered, our emotional side of our brain will hack the logical side of our brain. And that's why people make really stupid decisions when we're like overly emotional or triggered.
Yes.
And she's proven that those who have higher levels of spirituality are able to handle their emotions better and are able to navigate these decisions in a better way, especially in the military and veteran community. And so that's the science answer. I think the power of faith and believing in something bigger than yourself. I was with my chiropractor, who's like the nuttiest guy I've ever met, and he's amazing, and just has every theory you can imagine. But he's gone in and proven that there are nanocytes, which are in our skin, that receive light, and they're able to process light. And there are also those same nanocytes are in our brainstem and in our brains. And he basically said to me, like, why are those there? Why is there a receptor that is designed to receive light in a place that light doesn't shine? And then it begs the question: what if there's a light that exists beyond? What if there's a spiritual light? What if there's a light that exists beyond just sunlight? And what that light is that's impacting us? And Jesus said, "I'm the light of the world." And so I think it's given me such an anchor to come back to so consistently. And also, given my family, now that I'm married and have a couple of kids, like given us a focus point of where to go and how to build community.
What made you decide to actually start a podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I love to communicate. So we kind of do two forms of the podcast, where I'm teaching a message, telling great stories. I love story. I'm a student of story. And then, so that's the first form of me speaking. And then the other form is, interviewing these veterans. And I just saw a space, where I didn't see beautifully told stories of common everyday people, where it's not about getting a name. It's about the story of a person who doesn't have a name, who served this nation, and to inspire people through what these people have gone through and their resilience, and then how their faith has impacted their journey and impacted their service and impacted their time in the military. Or impacted their time after the military. And so, we just had a podcast come out this week of one of the, Navy SEALs that served on SEAL Team 6 and served under Jocko in Fallujah.
I listened to that.
Yeah, that was a fun one.
Yeah.
With Jimmy May. And then, telling stories, one that's coming out here next week is going to be, an active duty, a guy that just retired and of his suicide attempt and his multiple tours and how he just basically was so drunk he just started banging his head against the wall and the floor and did it until he passed out. So just these unbelievable stories, former CIA operatives and guys that were in Fallujah or Ramadi or all these different places. I love these stories and want them to be told.
How do you hope that the podcast can help veterans or anyone else that's listening?
Yeah, I would say that to know you're not alone. As they listen to this, and I can't tell you how often we hear from veterans that they can relate to the things that they've heard, and what they've gone through. So often, healing comes through awareness, and there's so many veterans that haven't talked about their stories and haven't processed through things or things that they could be carrying. When I remember flying in Iraq, and we were coming over Baghdad, and we got shot at a little bit. Had some rockets shot at us, and I remember we were like diving at the ground, or flying at the ground, and I looked over and I saw the other helicopter they were riding with, and flares were flying out, and I looked back over, and I'm staring, and it looked like we were just going to crash right into these buildings. And that was where I just prayed, and I was like, all right, Jesus, I'm ready. Like I'm going to die right now. Here we go. And then we pulled up and got out of there. But so I had dismissed that for so much of my life as that, well, I didn't die, and we weren't going to die because we pulled out, so therefore it doesn't matter, right? Like, it's, I didn't actually die, or we didn't crash, and so you just complete. But there's this incredible phrase, and it comes from the book The Body Keeps the Score, right? In that moment, everything in my body was prepared to die, and that's a traumatic experience, right? I thought I was going, it's done, and then it didn't happen, and then there's no resolve to that, right? You just move on to the next thing. And so, it wasn't until years later I had just stored up so much anxiety and, you know, um, some trauma in that, where it had never been dealt with. And then once I had this illumination through listening to somebody else's story, that, man, I just wept down crying, and it was this healing and this release that needed to take place in my body, and that came from hearing someone else's story and learning from that, right? And so many veterans have stories like that and have experiences like that that they need to process through, so that they can find greater levels of healing and then make a greater impact.